Aloha mai kako. Good morning, everybody. Mahalo nui for joining us for our first ever Kaliʻuokapaʻakai webinar series. We're super stoked to have you all here. This is going to be the first of 5 webinars. And many of you guys are joining us for the first time. So we're going to begin with a little bit of an introduction about Kaliʻuokapaʻakai, and then I'll hand things over to Susan. Got it. I think I got it. Hold on. All right, guys, technical difficulties real fast. So a little bit about the Kaliʻuokapaʻakai Collective. Huliauapaʻa serves as our backbone organization. And so what that means is that Huliauapaʻa serves as our fiscal sponsor and also provides the staffing for the Kaliʻuokapaʻakai Collective. A little bit about our hui and who is in our hui. Our hui is a group of culture practitioners, cultural resource managers, natural resource managers, marine resource managers, academics, educators, community members, state and federal agency workers, NHO workers, archaeologists, planners, lawyers, and also students. And so we all come together and we're all focused on Wahi kūpuna stewardship. And so our vision is empowered communities restoring, reinvigorating, and stewarding Hawaii's Wahi kūpuna. And our mission is to collectively activate and fulfill our kuleana to protect Hawaii's Wahi kūpuna and Ike kūpuna. Our 3 main areas that we're focused on as action items as a collective are protecting and restoring Wahi kūpuna, empowering community-based stewardship, and generating and managing knowledge. And so this webinar series is really aimed to help us forward our action items and to support that. So we're going to be covering various topics that are part of these sections, which is why we're here today to talk about SHPD and a little bit about the HP laws that we have here in Hawaii. And so that's really to help us, protect and restore Wahi kūpuna and empower community-based stewardship with the knowledge of these processes. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Susan. Susan Lebo is going to be talking today and presenting, and also Andrew McCallister, who's also recently joined the SHPD team, will also be talking a little bit with you all. And so just a little bit about the flow of this webinar. So Susan and Andrew are going to present for about an hour. And then after that, we're going to open it up for discussion and question and answer. And so you can submit your questions and answer via the question and answer tab that's on the bottom on your Zoom. And so I'll be going through that as well as La'akea. We'll be monitoring that and we'll be getting your questions to Susan and Andrew. But mahalo everybody for joining us. We're super stoked to have you guys all with us today. But let's get started. Okay, wait. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
Aloha, mahalo nui for providing us this opportunity to do this webinar. And just a little heads up, so what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about 6E, and Andrew's going to do that introduction. So that's going to be looking at the state rules regarding historic preservation. And then we will do 106 for the National Historic Preservation Act. And then we will start a little section on opening up the discussion about the future. So as you may or may not know, the rules as they are now were drafted in the 1990s and were ratified in 2002. So One of the things that SHPD is very interested in and is actively working on, and Kūpuna has joined us as a legal fellow to help rewrite the rules. And so clearly they need updating. And so we've put together this PowerPoint presentation, and then we've given some handouts in the form of a couple Word documents or PDFs and an Excel spreadsheet. And the Excel spreadsheet is to give you an opportunity to see provision by provision the rules as they pertain to government projects, 13.275, and how they pertain to private projects, 13.284. And the reason that was developed to train SHPD staff, but it's a good way to see the language as it exists now, and then also places where the rules you might see that you really think need to be amended or revised. Okay, so Andrew is going to start. Andrew is one of our newer employees. He joined the SHPD staff on Oahu in April of 2019, and will soon be moving to join our Maui staff. SHPD has made offers for 2 positions on Maui in December and 3 positions on Big Island. So Sean is going to help us train staff on Big Island. So hopefully in 2020 we'll have 4 to 5 new staff that will help us through this process. And so this is an opportunity for Andrew to become more familiar with the rules. And so he's going to help us this morning. So introduce Andrew.
Which one skips?
Yeah.
Which one skips?
There.
Good morning, I'm Andrew McCallister. I'm going to present to you the Hawaii rules for historic preservation. So you said this one?
Yeah.
Check on the presentation.
Oh. Okay, so this is a graphic of the structure of our office. SHPD falls under DLNR. We have our administrator, Alan Downer, and then our 3 branches, architecture, archaeology, and history and culture. This slide just generally describes the types of historic properties and what we do. It's good to note that the state of Hawaii considers buildings, sites, objects, structures, areas over 50 years old as historic properties. This slide is describing the difference between our Hawaii revised statutes and our administrative rules. So the Hawaii revised statutes is the laws written by the legislature, and the rules are what we follow to conduct the reviews for historic preservation reviews. This is the description of the triggers for our review and compliance for 68, which would be state projects. So this requires the state to consult with us regarding historic properties for any of their projects which may have impact to historic properties. 6042 would be for the private projects. So we review these based on if the private project requires permitting, licensing, certificate, land use change, subdivision, or any other entitlement. So the way it works is basically they'll go to the county agencies, and the county agencies can sometimes be selective as to what reviews they send to us for, or what projects they send to us for review.
So this is Susan. So the main thing to make understand here is that for a government project, all government projects that have potential to impact historic properties must come to us for the opportunity to comment. And our comments are that they are comments. We have the ability to make recommendations or requests. We don't have the ability to say good project, bad project, don't do this project, change your project. The thing that's really important about the private projects is it's incumbent on the agency that is issuing the permit, the approval, the certificate or whatever. They decide which projects to send to us. So technically, they are supposed to have qualified staff who can make that decision. And one of the things that you'll see as the legislature session moves forward this year is there will be a proposal before the legislature to empower the agencies to hire their own historic preservation staff. And in some ways that can be a good thing, because that means that hopefully instead of clerical staff who are untrained making a decision about what to send to us, that they'll have staff there who are more knowledgeable about the process, who will make those decisions. But as it is now, not all private projects that have potential to impact historic properties are currently coming to SHPD. So when you get people going, well, my neighbor, I had to do a permit, they didn't, or I had to go to SHPD and they didn't. That's because the county made that decision, okay? So that's one of the things that you might want to think about as we move forward on what gets reviewed. And then you'll notice that there are only two categories, public or government projects and private projects that require a permit, approval, etc. So a large landowner, such as KS, may want to do a project to inventory their Huliauapaʻa, but there's not currently a process for that within the rules. So that might be something going forward to think about.
All right, so these are the 6 steps of the historic preservation review process. We have identification, evaluation of significance, effect determination, mitigation commitments, detailed mitigation plan, and verification of completion. So the agency has to consult with us and obtain written approval for each of these 6 steps. Some of them can come in a single document, like identification and evaluation of significance, determination of effect. Oftentimes they're presented in the AIS for the project. Oh, sorry. Okay, so we get the next one. Who can participate in the historic preservation review process? So this outlines the participants. The primary participants in the process are DNR, which are represented by SHPD. And we also have what's called interested persons. And those consist of organizations or individuals that are concerned with the effect of the project on historic properties.
So note that this is the government process, and it clearly spells out that there is the role for interested parties. That can be an NHO, it can be a private individual, it can be any sort of organization or company. And then when you move to the private projects.
Right, so the private projects 284 differs from the government projects, is there's no mention of how these interested parties are to participate with the historic preservation review process. How can interested persons participate? These are basically outlined in these 2 sections. SHPD shall consider interested persons' comments and any submittals, acceptability in accordance with these 2 chapters. So comments must be submitted in writing within 30 days of SHPD's posting of notice of no historic properties affected determination, or posting notice of receipt of this information. I believe this is on our website. And SHPD shall post every Friday the receipt of relevant documents and issuance of no historic properties affected, or receipt of information.
Okay, so the purpose of this rule with respect to SHPD's website is that we are required to post every Friday all new things that are submitted to SHPD and that are logged in, and then anything for which a determination has been made. So that is the opportunity for any interested party, such as an NHO, a private individual, to say, I want to consult. So the big difference here between the 6E process and the 106 process is that 6E requires you to identify yourself as an interested party by project. So instead of the agency having a responsibility to reach out to you and say, hey, do you want to participate, or we're looking for your comments, it's incumbent on you to do that. So when, say, an AIS comes in or a big developer is submitting a permit application for their development and it's posted, that's when you have the opportunity to contact SHPD and say, I saw this on the website, it's assigned log number so-and-so, I want to participate, I want to consult. And you may want to review the AIS and be able to provide comments or the monitoring or whatever. And then you have a restricted number of days, which is 30 days, to provide those comments. And then for SHPD, the reason you have 45 days to review, we have to review an AIS, is we have 15 days to incorporate those comments into the review. And you can do that for private projects as well as government projects, but it's incumbent on you to notify SHPD that you want to participate.
So G talks about when there's a disagreement, the determination. So if the disagreement cannot be resolved through meetings with SHPD, an appeal can be made through Hawaii Historic Places Review Board within 30 days of the determination letter. And that is also a written request. It's important to note that this section doesn't occur in the private projects review, which would be 284.
So if you decide that SHPD has made a determination of, say, no historic properties affected, or we've decided that preservation is not needed on some wahi pana within a government project, this is your opportunity to say we disagree with that determination and request the Hawaii Historic Places Review Board to meet and to take up that issue.
All right, this next slide is, so how do you complete the 6 steps of the historic preservation review process? This talks about, so we have identification and inventory. Most important thing is the agency is responsible for doing identification. Evaluation of significance, I have that in another slide, we'll get to it in more detail, but criterion E is the only one that requires consultation. Determining effects of significance to historic properties. We have 2 options that we put out here for you. This is for the government projects, no historic properties affected, and then effect with proposed mitigation. That would differ for the private projects. So it would be effect with agreed upon mitigation commitments. Mitigation can occur in 5 forms, and I have more on that in another slide. Here, evaluation of significance criteria. So what we're looking for when the firms do their evaluation of significance is to be specific. It specifically calls out these, I forget what's called, integrity. So we have location, design, setting, material, workmanship, feeling, and association. So those should all be assessed to see if the historic property possesses these, and also how they contribute to the significance. So the significance, we have A, B, C, D, and E. E is important for consultation because it specifically calls out Native Hawaiian people or any other ethnic group, which is kind of a broad category. So when we're looking at these, we want to be sure that they're actually giving detailed information about why these historic properties fit into these significance criteria, specifically if they're saying they have data to inform further research. We want to know what data. If they're talking about this is important to a specific ethnic group, we want to know what ethnic group and what association with their traditional beliefs, events, oral accounts that they're finding these significant under these criteria as. Oh, additionally, a group of sites can collectively be argued as significant under any of these. What part of consultation gets reported to SHPD? So on our side, we see this in the significance evaluation. We would also see it in mitigation plans, and also in the AIS if they do consultation for significance evaluation. But it's important to know that consultation prior to significance evaluation is where you want to comment, because this is where you get your true opportunity to comment on a project and consult on a project, because an AIS will include your significance assessment and all of that. It will be presented to SHPD for concurrence. If you wait till it gets to the mitigation portion to consult, then you might be missing out on commenting on significance and other important aspects.
So one of the things that SHPD is doing as far as internal training is we are trying to ensure that SHPD staff look to see whether or not consultation occurred. And if a archaeological firm, for example, says there are 5 sites here and we've determined they're all significant under D for information, but they're not significant under E to a particular group, is to go back and say, whoa, wait a minute. The rules aren't designed for you as the archaeologist to make that decision on your own. It's designed to be a consultation process with the community, or various communities that have some tie to those resources. So we're trying to not accept AISs where that consultation hasn't occurred. So sometimes we will indicate who we think should be consulted, and that the rules as they stand right now only call out one organization, and that's OHA. So that's one organization for the Hawaiian community and no organizations called out for any other community. And clearly so one of the things that we want obviously is for the SHPD staff to become more knowledgeable about who might be representative for particular communities. So if we have a Chinese temple that is being affected, we need to know which groups that we should be able to tell the applicant or agency that they should consult with. The other thing is that it's not the way the rules are written, and if they're correctly applied, it is not up to the archaeologist to decide which criteria each site is significant under. It is supposed to be a consultation process. And it says that if there's any potential for the site to be significant under E, then that consultation needs to occur. So I think part of it is having the community better, and OHA, we've had discussions with them, to better identify what kinds of sites might be in that category of significance under E. So traditionally people have said, okay, burials, religious sites, but they haven't consistently put, for example, trails, certain habitation sites. Obviously, if you have a large agricultural complex like the Kona Field System, that would be. So I think part of what SHPD would benefit from is having better understanding from various communities as to which kinds of sites would be they want to be consulted on. And we obviously don't need to consult on every temporary hab site or every C shape, but there are categories of sites that are being removed from the landscape because they are being treated individually rather than collectively. So you might say this C shape, we collected enough information. But if you say that for every C shape, we won't have any C shapes left on the landscape. So we also need to look at things being considered collectively, like Andrew said, as a landscape. So we need to make sure where we still have cultural landscapes preserved, we want to keep those as opposed to treating each of those sites individually. So the rules allow for that, but that might be something that we want to look at to make more clear and provide better guidance for how those decisions get made.
So here's the 5 forms of mitigation that are possible. We get a lot of archaeological data recovery, but we do have room for ethnographic documentation, historical data recovery, architectural recordation, which we do get a fair amount of, and preservation, which can include avoidance, protection, stabilization, rehabilitation, construction, appropriate and cultural use.
So again, when it comes to mitigation, there's nothing that prevents, if there's rule change, that there could be other categories of mitigation. One of the things that we have a real concern about, and Dr. Downer, who's the administrator, has made mention of, is that archaeological data recovery is consistently in the form of archaeological monitoring. And we need to look at maybe that's not the direction that we should be going. Also, there is room within each of these categories, not only to add more categories, but is to change how decisions get made, because the consulting parties, the interested parties, have the ability not only to make a decision about what is significant under criterion E, but they also have a role in making decisions about mitigation. So just because the archaeologists made their initial recommendation of archaeological monitoring or no further work does not mean that the interested parties can't say, no, we think that there should be preservation. And that preservation, maybe we think that preservation should be in the form of stewardship and cultural reuse, what have you. So you have greater role in terms of making those decisions for government projects than you do for private. So the 284, the difficulty there is that it's on what the state recognizes as private land, and therefore you can't force a private landowner to preserve, for example, if you don't. But there's nothing that says you can't work with the private landowner to try and get them to be open to that as an avenue of how you would like to have those resources treated. Mm-hmm. And most landowners have been pretty receptive when they've been asked, and some of them actually say, I want to preserve everything that's on my property, even if the archaeologist says they don't think it needed. So don't think that just because it's private land, you can't provide input and you can't try and coordinate or interface with the landowner and SHPD about maybe this can be preserved and so forth. So
also important about this is the mitigation is called out by each property. So you could have a situation where a project has different mitigations for different properties. This is verification of completion of a detailed mitigation plan. So we have a process which is called the 2-step, where they may have completed all the field work for a project, but it'll take time to produce the report for it. So we have a route for them to go where they can do the field work and present to us that they've completed all the steps, and they can move forward with their project and submit their report at a later date.
So the Heart Rail is a perfect example where they've completed all of their archaeological inventory survey work, they've completed their interim protection plans, they've completed their monitoring plans, data recovery, burial treatment plans, and so forth. They've conducted the archaeological data recovery work. And so in this case, they completed that work in 2014, and then they went back to construction. So they were able to start construction without having completed the archaeological report for data recovery. But in this case, they're not yet to City Center 4, which is where most of their data recovery excavations occur. They've generated a report, so that will be done before the construction actually actively starts. So that's a consultation process to schedule when things can get completed, particularly for large projects where you can't necessarily complete all of the documentation prior to them needing to initiate construction.
And then this last slide for 6E is just a general outline of SHPD's obligations for the 6E review process. We're obligated to concur, issue project defect determination, concur and consult on significance of historic properties, propose mitigations. A lot of times, like I said before, that will all come in at the AIS level. We ensure NHOs and other interested parties and the public have the opportunity to participate. And we ensure that agencies also address 106 consultation for projects that may require 6E as a government project, but it also has some sort of federal funding, which would trigger Section 106. And we also do training and outreach like we're doing today. And I think that's it.
All right. So just as we transition into the National Historic Preservation Review process, which is the federal review process, we want to call out some of the major differences between 6E and 106. And the first one is consultation, as we already said. 106 is a consultation process, whereas the 6E process has a consultation component. It has not been adequately applied in past years. I think it needs to be strengthened. I think we want to get more community engagement in that process, particularly as these are resources on both private and public land. The main difference with respect to that consultation is that under 6E, it's the agency's job to identify who to consult with. If they're consulting for 106, okay? So the agency, if that's say that's the Army, it's the Army's responsibility to identify who to consult with. They oftentimes will reach out to SHPD. So the more interested parties identify themselves to SHPD, we can help ensure that they are included in the consultation. Under 6E, again, the more we can get various interested parties identifying we want to consult on this island or in this community or on this particular resource. We can do a better job of ensuring that that process is occurring appropriately. Okay, so the National Historic Preservation Act is generally triggered by a federal agency that is either, so the project is involving federal funds, the project's located on federal land, or the project requires a federal permit or approval. So it could actually be on private property. But if the person's doing an activity that requires, for example, an FCC permit or approval for what they're doing, so say they want to launch a weather balloon, then that would be a project that would be both a 6E private project and a federal undertaking. So it doesn't have to be a project initiated by a federal agency. It could be a private project or it could be a government project. Okay. So the rules, or the Section 106 says that the federal agency must take into account the effects of their undertakings on historic properties, and they must afford the council a reasonable opportunity to comment. So the council is the Advisory Council of Historic Preservation. And the council generally doesn't choose to participate because obviously they couldn't participate in every federal project. That would just be overwhelming. So they usually get involved if their project is complex. So obviously, or if there's federal funds involved. So it could still be a small project. It could be a private project that needs some federal funds, but there's some real issues with respect to the project. Maybe it's controversial, maybe it's affecting a wetland in addition to historic properties. And so there may be a reason that various parties involved might ask the council to participate. They must be afforded the opportunity. It's up to them to agree or to decline. Okay, so 106 process still has the same steps as 6E. You have the identification of the historic properties, you determine the integrity and significance, but you have the added requirement of determining whether that historic property is also eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. Because undertakings, when it comes to determining the effect of the project or undertaking, it is only determined if it affects a site that's been determined eligible for the register. So it could be under 6E, we may say it's a significant historic property, but if it's determined not eligible for the National Register, then they could end up with an effect that's no historic properties affected because it doesn't count. Now, it is not required that that site or historic property be eligible at the national level. So there are different levels in which the site could be identified as eligible: the national level, the state, and the local. It only has to meet one of those. So it could just be significant at the local level. And that's why the consultation by the community and the various organizations is really critical, because it's going to be at the local level that you're going to have that knowledge to make a decision that it is should be listed. It does not have to actually make it on the register. It does not actually have to be nominated. It just has to be determined to meet the criteria. And then you must look at that historic property in terms of the potential for the project to affect. It does call out that you must consult with Native Hawaiian organizations specifically, but it also says all other interested parties and the public. So you don't have to be anybody other than, I'm a neighbor down the street and I have a concern that they're going to be putting this wind turbine farm in my neighborhood. So who participates in the process? There's the professional standards that tells you the agencies and what those agency staff have to have in terms of their professional expertise. There's something called a lead federal agency, and that's when you have more than one federal agency that plays a role in a project. So you could have a federal agency such as you're doing a highway project, and the lead federal agency could be the Federal Highway Administration, but the project's going through the airport or near the airport, so you might have the FCC, or it might go through a marsh area or water, navigable waters, so you might have the Corps of Engineers. So hopefully one of those agencies will identify themselves to be the lead, and they will carry out the 106. Some agencies decide they don't want to do that, and so you could end up with a project that has multiple agencies all consulting, and they would each be responsible for their 106 consultation. So the consultation, it is the responsibility of the federal agency to conduct that consultation. Now, they can delegate to another organization or another agency. So they could delegate, the feds could delegate to the state, or they could delegate to the county, for example. But at the end of the day, they hold the responsibility to ensure that it has occurred and it's been done properly. So when you consult under 106, they must tell you that they're consulting for this project under 106. If the project also requires them to follow the state rules 6E, they need to tell you they're consulting under both. They cannot use one consultation for the other. So if you come to a meeting and they tell you that they're consulting for 6E, they cannot count it for 106. if they don't tell you that they're consulting for 106. So it has to be clear that they are indeed consulting for 106. So we actually have a project on Maui that the 106 is being reopened because the agency failed to do that. So, so usually what happens is the agency will send out their initiation of consultation letter, and they will ask for input. They will say, here's what we know about our project area, which is called the area of potential effect. And here's what we know about what historic properties might be present, okay? And usually they will ask, one, if you want to participate, and two, what information you have to share regarding historic properties, okay? Now, a historic property does not have to be tangible. It can be a traditional cultural property, for example, and it's incumbent on the agency to gather this information and to take all historic properties into consideration. And that's why there's an important role for NHOs and other interested parties to provide this information. But it doesn't mean that they don't have to do any work. They still have a responsibility to try and gather that information. Again, it's the agency who's responsible to determine whether or not a property is eligible for the National Register. They will often rely on, their archaeological consultants, but NHOs and the public and other interested parties also have the ability to provide input on that they think it's eligible, and here's why. And the agency must take all of that into consideration. It doesn't mean that at the end of the day they may agree and it may make a determination it's eligible. They may determine otherwise. If there's a disagreement between the agency and SHPD, then that usually will go to the advisory council, and the advisory council will try and see if an agreement can be reached. And if not, then a determination will be made. And it won't be SHPD that makes the determination, it'll be the federal agency. So we've been successful on some of our disagreements that did go to the advisory council. We had some with the Army, for example. We won some, we didn't win some. So, but at least it means that got elevated and got reevaluated. So there was an opportunity for more information to be taken into consideration. So the outcome is you have three choices under 106. There's no historic properties affected, which is the same as it is under 6E. Or you can have an effect, and that effect can either be an adverse effect or a no adverse effect. And one of the things that's really important to focus on here is that to get to a no adverse effect, in the past, people said, oh, no historic or no adverse effect because we're doing archaeological monitoring or we're doing data recovery. No longer possible. If you are in effect affecting that site by doing data recovery, that's an effect. So that's no longer considered a no adverse effect. You can get a adverse effect when you physically destroy or damage any part of a historic property. So that would include archaeology. If you alter the property through restoration or rehab, repair, maintenance, etc., and you do not apply the Secretary of the Interior standards for treatment. So say the standard says you must do in-kind replacement of the windows, which means that you'd use the same materials and the same window style, but you decide to put in a different style, then that would be considered an adverse effect. If you remove the property from its historic location, so if you move it down the road, then that. And then when you change any of the character of the property's use that contributes to its historic significance. So when you're doing the identification and you're evaluating its integrity, the 7 aspects of integrity, location, setting, feeling, and so forth, those help define what are the character defining features of that historic property. So say your property is a agricultural landscape. You want to be able to say the location, the setting, the relationship between this feature and that feature and that feature, and this is all a connected landscape. Those are character defining features. So somebody could say, well, I'm going to preserve 90% of this, but I'm going to put a road through the middle. Then you've affected some of what you've defined as the character defining features. And that's why the integrity is very important, so that you can actually say, here's why this property is significant to us. It has these features, and you're going to affect them. So your adverse effect could be visual. It doesn't have to actually touch it. So for example, a project on Kauai, they were widening a road, okay? And there was a heiau down below. They weren't touching the heiau. It was a good couple miles away. But the road as it existed at the time of their project had trees along the side. So somebody driving down the road couldn't see the heiau. So, but when they went to widen the road, the trees were going to come out. Now people could see it. That became an adverse effect. The community said that's not acceptable. So that counts as an adverse effect. So to get away from that adverse effect, they ended up putting in new trees. So that, again, they put in a barrier. So the historic property, there was not a visual impact to that historic property. And so you need to look at, it doesn't have to actually touch the historic property to be an adverse effect, okay? And then anytime a historic property transfers out of federal ownership. So if, for example, at Naval Air Station, Barbers Point, the land transfers from the Navy to another entity, in this case, a private entity, that transfer is by definition an adverse effect unless there are restrictions or conditions put on to ensure preservation of that historic property. So if you have a structure over here and it's on land that's going to be transferred, there has to be either a covenant attached to it or some sort of preservation agreement that ensures it will be preserved. So again, don't have to actually touch it, but it's going out of federal ownership. And so that becomes an adverse effect. So you can have a no historic properties affected if you're not actually touching anything or you'd have no historic properties there. If you have an adverse effect, to get to a no adverse effect, you have to do something, either avoidance measures, things to minimize that effect, apply the Secretary of Interior standards. Now, what's interesting is that the Secretary of Interior standards that are called out in the 106 has to do with architecture. It doesn't call out standards for archaeology. It doesn't mean that you can't come up with things of, we're going to avoid this historic property, or we're going to do adaptive reuse, cultural appropriate reuse, whatever. So again, there's room for negotiation. And I think we're almost done. So here's our contact info. So Alan Downer is the administrator. He is also the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer. Hinana Rodriguez is our History and Culture Branch. I'm the Archaeology Branch Chief. Tanya is our most senior architectural historian. And then Julia Flaus has also been added to our architecture staff. So you can contact any of us with questions. You also can go to our website, and it has a complete list of SHPD staff, and you can reach out to any one of them. So follow. And the main thing that we want to say is that the preservation and sustainability of these historic properties, or these Wahi Pana, is the responsibility of all of us. We want to be better partners and stewards within that role. So we appreciate the opportunity to participate today, and we look forward to your how we could do that better. And so what we're going to do now is, I just gave a slide as a starting talking point. Obviously, one of the things that we're interested in is revising the rules. They are now ratified 18 years ago. I think it's time. And they were actually drafted in the 90s, so that's even further back. So the things that SHPD staff are particularly interested in is consultation, making sure that consultation has a more upfront and clear role for community and NHO and public engagement. We are looking for preservation plans. Those rules currently allow for things like stewardship or community cultural use, but it's not a it's not the primary recommendation in the preservation plans that are being created. We would like to see that as a better avenue, so that these are not just like museums on the landscape. These are living places and living resources, and we need to find a way to better handle that. We also want the preservation plans to look at, you want to go get the other staff so they can see. The preservation plans to deal with that there are different kinds of preservation. So most people think that when we develop a preservation plan, that means that site's going to be preserved in perpetuity, okay? That preservation in perpetuity comes only if there's an added component that's not currently called out, and that is if there is a meets and bounds survey done and it's put into a preserve that is recorded with the Bureau of Conveyances, or a easement. Violations, we would like to expand what represents a violation. For us, a lot of the violations are non-compliance, where somebody's not complying with the preservation provisions, or that they're not complying with the monitoring plans. They fail to put in the interim protection measures. They don't write a monitoring plan and then they go do monitoring, things like that. And then overall, we want to improve the quality of the archaeology that's being done. It's highly variable. We have people who do poor field work and poor reports, to people who do good field work and good reports. We have everything in between. Highly variable with the GPS and GIS data. One of the things that we're looking at there is we want sub-meter accuracy of the GPS. We have somebody who sent us a plan recently that says their GPS will be good for 10 to 15 meters, which is equivalent to 30 to 45 feet. That's really not useful. Things like recording the stratigraphy, ensuring that the consultation is being conducted and that there's a write-up about what that consultation looks like. We're also looking to see that the criteria to become a principal investigator is tightened. I can just express my own personal issue, and that is I don't like paper PIs. I don't like it when you have somebody who's listed as a PI and they're not on island and they're not actively engaged in the project. I'd like to see criteria for archaeological monitors. Personally, I think somebody should have 1 year's experience doing archaeological monitoring under a supervisor on the island in which they're been hired to do archaeological monitoring. I think that maybe there needs to be a category for field supervisors, and they might be the people who are qualified and actually on site rather than the PI, but there needs to be, some parameters to make sure that these projects are being done by people in the have the experience. And then the last one is there currently are no rules for private large landowners such as Kamehameha Schools, who might want to be actively inventorying what resources they have on their property. And there's no way for us to currently do that review. So those are just ideas to get us started. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. Right now we're open for the questions and comments section. Some of the questions that we've gotten so far are, will this presentation be available for download? And will the PowerPoint be available to webinar participants? And just to get the answer out to everyone, we're recording the presentation right now. We're not gonna make it available for download necessarily, but we are gonna load it up onto our Huliauapaʻa YouTube channel, so you can view it from there. So, I mean, you can't download it and watch it from the plane, but you can stream it. And we will be emailing out the PowerPoint presentation as well as some handouts that Susan has provided for us out to all the participants as well. Some other questions that we have. So Natalie Kirishima is joining us, and she asks, does SHPD interact with the Cultural Resource Commission?
It varies. There is something called a CLG, a certified local government, and currently the island of Oahu, the city and county of Honolulu, is the only county that does not have a CLG. But we do participate with the CLGs on the other islands. Currently not on a regular basis because they don't all meet on a regular basis, but also because we don't have staff on Maui, for example, at the moment. But our goal this year is to become more actively engaged with them on a more regular basis.
Susan, this is Sean.
Hi, Sean.
I do more often than not at least participate as much as I can with the CRC commission up here. If some of you know that Teresa Donham is on that board for the county up here on their CRC. So I do get invited, and I do try to participate as much as possible. In fact, today, there's a meeting today, and I do get a lot of requests for them for information. And so, yes, the Hawaii Island CRC is very active, right. And they do a lot.
The Lanai one has kind of taking a back seat for a little bit, but I think they're going to get back up and running. And usually what happens is either we attend in person or we do by phone. And the same is true with Kauai. They've had a few months in which they didn't have meetings, but I think that they're looking to try and be more regular, and we will be attending those. And the CRCs are actually very important for us because they provide a role with respect to identifying projects that are coming online that might be a county project, a private development, et cetera, that for which there may be concern by the community. And this is our avenue to realize that that project is of greater significance for our involvement in our review. So.
Awesome. Brian is asking, what is the projected timeline for the SHPD to update its administrative roles, and how can agencies and public participate?
Can I ask Ku'upua to?
You can speak. Okay.
Aloha, I'm Ku'upua. I'm the post-JD legal fellow that's going to be working on the administrative rules. My timeline right now is to have, at the very least, a draft of the rules for each of the branches within SHPD for internal review. My timeline is set for August. So I'm hoping to, at the very least, have at least 2 branches worth, the archaeology and then the history and culture branches, a first draft of that. And then I was going to open it up I have to open up for public review, and I want as much public review and mana'o from everybody, especially the ones attending this webinar. So I want that to be available at the very least by the end of this year for public review and comment, or for any input that you folks might have before we send it out for public review. But again, that first draft, my timeline is for August, and that's just the first of, I'm foreseeing at the very least 3 or 4 drafts. So I would love any and all of your mana'o and kokua along the way. So any point in the process you guys want to jump in or send me mana'o, my email is kkck@hawaii.edu. So please feel free to email me.
Do you want us to also provide your email in the follow-up email that we're sending out?
Sure.
So we'll provide you all with the follow-up, with Ku'upua's email and the follow-up email that we'll be sending out later as well. So we have another question. How can we get information about submittals listed on the weekly SHPD list?
Okay, so you can just go to the SHPD website, and there's a link in there for everything that's posted each Friday. And there is sometimes a delay between when something is actually received by us and it gets posted. And that's simply just because it takes a while to log everything in. But the clock doesn't start for review until it's been logged in. And then it will have an entry on that website that says we received it. It'll have a log number, and then just a brief description of what it is. It's a permit application for this, or, you know, the Department of Design and Construction is doing a wastewater project or whatever. So.
Okay. And is there a way that the public can get links to the actual plans or submittal documents?
Okay, so SHPD is working to scan and upload things so we have everything in an electronic format. We've asked that all submittals come to us electronically, but they currently don't. But what you need to do is just go and say, I'm making a request to consult regarding this project. Can you provide me a copy of the application or whatever? So at this point, there's not a link that you could go to because there's a time delay, because internally we have to find staff to upload those things. But if you say, I want to consult, or I want to review the archaeological inventory survey for project X, then we'll respond. And we'll have to find a way to maybe have a way for those things to get routed to a certain place, because right now those requests come to my mailbox, and I have thousands of emails. And so I'd hate to be delaying a response to your request. So we'll have to figure out how to do that, because right now we're not getting a lot of those.
We have another question. Who is the Hawaii Historic Places Review Board, and how long do they have to respond to appeals? And are their decisions final? Sorry.
Okay, so the Historic Hawaii Review Board meets usually quarterly. It can vary from year to year, but I think they meet a minimum of quarterly. And they are the review board that they review nominations for the Hawaii State of Hawaii Register of Historic Places and the National Register of Historic Places. We have not had very many requests to review decisions. So I couldn't tell you how, I mean, what they would have to do is get on the agenda for that meeting, and then the committee, the review board would review that request, and usually they make a decision in the meeting. If they need additional information, they may ask for that, and then they may defer it to another meeting for a decision. And then Dr. Downer usually attends those review board meetings. So he would certainly be able to answer more questions. So if anybody has more questions about the review board, please send us an email and we'll follow up to try and answer those.
Great. We have another question. Will the new rules include the provision for proactive projects by large landowners, or is that for a subsequent update? Like KS.
Oh, like KS.
Yeah.
I mean, I want to add into the rules the whole how there's no rules right now affording any review process for inventorying those properties. So if that's the kind of proactive management they're talking about, then yes.
Yeah.
At the very least, I am drafting that into the rules.
Yeah.
So
yeah, we very much want to have that, and we also want it to include some agencies such as state parks. State parks does not have enough staff to go out and actively conduct an AIS for all of their land, but they do some reconnaissance surveys and they identify historic properties. And we want to make sure that we have a mechanism for them to apply for a state inventory of historic places, an SIHP site number, and a way for them to get recorded even in the absence of an AIS, so that that information is out there and can be taken into consideration when projects do come online and have potential to impact.
Awesome. We have a question of, during the review process, would SHPD prefer applicants to consult at each step of the review process?
Well, what we would like is that the agency or applicant to start the consultation as early as possible, so that they can. So usually what we do is we ask people who are starting a project, such as they're going to do a residential development. We'd like them to come in as early as possible to say, here's our project area, here's what we're planning to do, so that we can tell them at that stage what we want them to do, what we want the AIS to look like, what we want the consultation to look like, to tell them that, hey, you're going to need to consult, you need to go out and identify whether that's OHA, various civic clubs, et cetera. So as early as possible to help them get through the process correctly and help us so that we're not getting incomplete reviews or projects that we then have to spend a lot of time on because there are issues that they sort of neglected.
How does SHPD track and respond requests for interested parties to be consulted under 6E?
Okay, so usually what happens is, right now I'd say that for most projects, so like for Maui, we know who most of the interested parties are because when we attend SHPD attends the burial council meetings, and usually they're there. Or the party has identified themselves and we find the same parties over and over again, indicating that they want to participate. The History and Culture Branch maintains the list of parties who identified themselves, particularly with respect to iwi kūpuna, but not solely for that purpose. But we also maintain a list just because when federal projects, we try to make sure that the federal agency has contacted those parties who've identified themselves. So we had a project where the archaeologist came in for a project and they hadn't identified any NHOs to consult with. It's a private project, but we said, well, right next door is this other project, and here's 5 or 6 parties who identified themselves for that. You need to consult with them. So we try and use our knowledge about who's identified themselves. And we definitely would like to see more parties get engaged, because right now it's a limited number of people who are repeat participants, which means that some of the broader community might not be well represented.
Will SHPD accept consultation that occurs during the HRS 343 process or require separate consultation for 6E specifically?
So we're not engaged in the 343 process because that's the EAs and EISs. But if somebody has consulted under that and they wish to submit their written comments that they provided to 343, we welcome those to say we would like to, have these taken into consideration with respect to the 6E, or they can ask to meet and have a verbal consultation. And at the moment, SHPD doesn't have a role with respect to 343, in part because there's no requirement that we review EAs and EISs. We do have the ability to review and provide comment, but generally don't because we don't have enough staff to handle that workload.
Does each step in the consultation process need SHPD written concurrence?
So our concurrence is when we accept the document, whether that's the AIS or the preservation plan, or we do a concurrence with a federal agency effect determination. But usually what we do is we try and look at, so the federal agencies, we can ask them to provide documentation of who they consulted with and what was the outcome of that consultation, and we often do that. We can do that also for the 6E. So oftentimes we'll reach out to the agency or the archaeological firm that did an AIS and say, please include in your documentation who you consulted with and what comments you received. It can add to the length of time it takes to get something through the process, but the process is built for that purpose. So.
Thank you. Sorry. Are there any other questions?
Aloha, this is Kelly from Hawaiʻi Island. I just want to mahalo Susan and her gang at SHPD and Sean over here for being available for this webinar. Looking at this slide here, what you listed as your guys' focus kind of efforts going forward, it's very much in line with what we're looking at doing, and supporting with the Kaliʻuokapaʻakai collective. So mahalo for that. I hope we can continue to collaborate and work together to make some of these things happen this year, if can. I'd like to just kind of get your guys' thoughts on, now that you know a little bit more about the collective, how we can support you guys. I know you guys are trying really hard and overworked and understaffed, and I think as our Hui and collective, we'd like to support you folks more, and then maybe even like how you guys can support us more, like with stuff like this. I think it's really valuable to share what you shared with those outside of just the industry, archaeological technicians and stuff, and just the community, so they better understand the process. So yeah, just looking forward, maybe some of your thoughts on how we can kākoʻo one another.
So I think that there are several things that you guys that can do that would be extremely helpful for us. One is under consultation. I think that there's a lot of poor consultation. So for us, consultation means that the parties engaged in the consultation actually have the potential to affect the outcome. If it's a foregone conclusion in terms of what the project's going to look like, what the project footprint is, what the mitigation is going to be, et cetera, that's not consultation, because you have to have the ability to change the outcome. So one, it would be helpful to maybe provide things that we can use to better train ourselves within SHPD. regarding being effective in consultation and ensuring that appropriate consultation is being conducted by the agencies we engage with. I think that in terms of preservation, being able to provide, you know, a range of mana'o about what might be appropriate preservation that is beyond avoidance and preserve in place and make it static. That would include things about how do we become more proactive? How do we maybe have processes that are better defined to ensure the ability to create stewardship agreements, to provide, even for private landowners. I mean, not all private landowners are going to want somebody to come on and take stewardship, but some will. And we shouldn't make it a foregone conclusion that it can't occur. In the way the preservation plans are right now, most private landowner preservation plans don't really have a component for that. Looking at what preservation in perpetuity might look like. So the rules right now, the preservation plans they're misleading in that people think that that is preservation in perpetuity. It is not. It is preservation. So if it's in a preservation plan and it has not been officially set aside as a preservation easement or is not tied to the deed, then landowner A can transfer the land to landowner B, and landowner B can decide, well, you know, I don't really want to preserve it. And then they can come back and say, well, I no longer want to preserve this. What mitigation can I do? And then I can take it off the landscape. So if something's really important and worth preserving in perpetuity, then we need to tighten up the preservation rules to be able to decide whether that preservation that's being recommended is actually going to be temporary or permanent in perpetuity. So in terms of violations, I'll let you know that the legislature opened today, which I'm sure most all of you knew, but that there is a bill is being introduced to change the rules with respect to violations. And a draft that's sort of been started is going to be in the legislature this year. And I think that, again, you really can help decide what that should look like. I personally think that non-compliance with, you know, doing archaeology without a permit, that to me is a violation. Doing monitoring without a monitoring plan, failing to put in the interim protection measures and something is damaged. And there needs to be a way to remove somebody's permit, to say, you aren't doing what your permit is telling you should be doing. And we don't currently have guidance, and there's nothing in the rules that says, okay, if you have 3 of these non-compliance violations, each one will have a fee or fine attached to them. And if you accrue 3 of them, then your permit will be revoked for the rest of the year. So I would like to see, you know, some input about how you think the archaeology profession can do a better job. So that, to me, I think is something you could do that would be extremely helpful for us. And then also just the proactive projects with the large landowners. Because they don't exist in the rules right now, I think we really need to think about how can we build them into the rules. And so I think KS and some of those other large landowners, you know, you've already started discussions with them. So I think that you're probably further along than us with respect to how you think they might be built into the process and what that process might look like. So I think that would be really helpful. And then last, I think that if you can identify any other parties out there, whether that's an agency or a community group or whatever, that we could provide some sort of workshop to
Hey Susan, sorry.
better understand. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but I mean, in terms of, I think you're kind of getting to part of what I wanted to address, but also about consultation.
Sure.
You know, I've reached out, I've talked to people at OHA in the past, and I've asked them, you know, in terms of, I don't want to go on video. I'm sitting in my office. Well, in terms of consultation, I always found it very interesting that, you know, when people are quick to put their name on that consultation list, but a lot of times, you know, there's no response from those people that put their names on the list. And I really wish people would understand that no comment is actually a comment, you know. And I asked OHA at one point, you know, you should train the people who put their names in as consulting parties so that they understand that a no comment is still a comment, you know, and it affects the outcome. You know, they have a list of 20 people and nobody responded. And that kind of says something about the project as well, if, you know, as much as if they all had comments about it. So, you know, I think that's an issue sometimes with consultation, is that people are quick to put their names in, but, you know, for whatever reason, don't respond. And I think that's something that we need to train our interested parties in. You know, just a letter saying, you know, we're not going to comment because of this or something, rather than just not commenting at all.
And I think that that's a very important point, because then the federal agency comes back and says, well, we reached out to 25 NHOs and we got one comment, and it makes it look like they actually consulted with 25 people, but 24 of them, you know, didn't actually provide a comment, but it counts as if they did.
Mm-hmm. So just getting people to understand that, and, you know, even if it's some sort of letter that, you know, speaks about why they don't have a comment or something, that would be more helpful than no comment at all, or take your name off the list so you don't appear as you've been consulted for the project. But some sort of training for people that choose to be a part of the consultation process, so that that part of it can be better for not for the agency, but for the resource.
Great. Good mana'o, Uncle Sean. Are there any other questions or comments? Anybody want to make a comment in there?
Now's your chance.
Okay. If you have a question, you should raise your hand, because not.
Any kind of questions, don't worry. We won't take it personal.
Okay. It looks like we don't have any other questions. Oh wait, 2 people are raising their hand.
See?
Okay, raising your hand. You gotta submit something. Availability for okay, so Brian Toda is asking, what's your availability for meeting next week with DHHL? Are you asking Susan folks, Uncle Sean folks, or are you asking Kaliʻuokapaʻakai? Susan.
Yay!
Susan, that's the one that our office has not given me dates except for Sam.
Okay.
DHHL requested a meeting.
Okay. I'm sure we can coordinate something next week. If you just drop me an email today, we'll get something on the schedule.
Good job, Brian, taking full advantage of resources at hand. Nancy said, mahalo for this encouraging initiative. I look forward to DHHL participating in this process. Thank you, Nancy.
Somebody put a question on the chat part of this thing.
Okay, good find. I don't see the question.
It's from Carmela. She said, professional vocational licensing. This is required for land surveyors with a third exam in Hawaii land description. So I don't know if that's a question or, I mean, archaeologists have to be licensed by us.
So the way the rules are right now, a person who gets a permit to be a PI basically just has to meet some minimum requirements in terms of having a minimum number of years experience in Hawaii or the Pacific, having a graduate degree, supposed to be knowledgeable of the rules, although there's nothing that says how we measure knowledgeable. And clearly those who don't comply with the rules would suggest that maybe they're not knowledgeable. But we don't, and there's been some questions about maybe having them have a test. I do think that we need to look at whether we want to beef up the requirements with respect to criteria to become like I say, a PI, an archaeological monitor, field supervisor. Right now, there's only the listing for PIs. And we do get a lot of applicants, some from the US mainland or elsewhere. And there we're kind of looking at, you know, do they have recent experience other than their experiences 20 years ago, and things like that. But I think we need to beef up those criteria. And if you have recommendations, we'd certainly like to know what they are.
We have another question. Is it okay to schedule an early conference or meeting when determining trenching and survey areas? So an earlier consultation with SHPD.
Yes, so the rules don't currently say anything about coming to SHPD before you start your AIS, but we put that in all our letters when we request one. We ask that the archaeological firm and their project proponent come in and that we discuss what is going to be their AIS testing strategy and to agree on that. One, because it means that we're getting away from firms who do the work and then we come back and say the work's inadequate. We think all the parties should know up front what needs to be done. And this is an opportunity to have that first stage of consultation about the project.
We have another question. Sorry. Don't go, Sean.
No, go ahead.
Okay. It's, can ancient or historic trails get a SIHP number if there's no physical attributes on the ground?
TCP sort of situation.
Yeah, I mean, well, so far, all of them, I think that we have some sort of physical attribute. I think that it's open to looking at whether or not, like you say, TCPs, for example, though not everything. So like the night marchers going through Kauai, I think those have a number without actually having a physical representation on the ground. So it's certainly open to discussion because I think the rules were written when they were really thinking about physical and not thinking about TCPs, for example. So there needs to be some way that we can take into account the full range of Wahi that are out there, not all of which would be physical remains on the ground. But I'm not sure how we're going to do that. So welcome the comments to help think that out. I know some people, we've made use of historical maps, for example, say that the trail was here. Even the trail may now be under a road, for example, and it's still got a number. So.
Carol Marie said, mahalo for providing this presentation. Reading statutes leaves a lot to interpretation. Look forward to participating in the HRR revisions. So kūpuna, yay, you have somebody who wants to participate. Mahalo, Sean, for your comment on providing comment, even if it is no comment. And yeah, we do better after hearing your comments.
So just along those same lines, the Excel spreadsheet that you will be getting shows the rules as they are written now, line by line, so that, and they're a comparison of the government, the 275, to the private projects, 284. And so you can see where you have concerns about the language. You can see where you think the language is weak, or the language doesn't express what you think needs to be there. So we kind of built it, and then we have some comments off to the side, and those comments were designed for training purposes, but you may find some of them useful. But the idea there is that you can actually see a side-by-side comparison, because there has been some discussion about combining the government and the 275 and 284 into a single HAR. And so you want to make sure that you get the strongest language for each of those things.
We have a question regarding standardization. Regarding maps, can there be one historical map everyone uses, state or island?
Okay, so our website, we're trying to build more and more resources. So we have up there what is currently recognized by the, what is it called? The Geographical Committee of some sort, state has, so we have Oʻahu maps up there. We have the Moku, we have on down the line. So the idea is to try and get it so that we don't get two reports by two different firms and they're looking at the property right next door to each other and they have them in two different ahupua'a. So that's what the purpose there is, to try and get that standardization. We recognize that not all of the parties that are putting into the development of that statewide ahupua'a maps are in agreement. So there will probably be some more changes. But again, it's something that's a resource, that's a starting point, and we welcome input so that we can continue to move it towards a more standardized. We're also looking to put out explicit rules, because they're currently, you'll notice that the rules don't have anything regarding GPS or GIS. And we want to make sure that, one, we're getting better quality GPS data, that people report the kind of GPS unit they're using, the accuracy. We want things that are sub-meter, not 30 meters. That data gets shared. One of the things that we left off the list that it just popped back into my head is curation. I think the curation rules need to be revised. There needs to be an opportunity for curation to be cultural use, not just put it in an archive and not just, and there needs to be a way to move collections out of archaeology firms' storage into some facilities. And for the community to potentially have a role in making decisions regarding curation, and not just leave it to an agreement between the landowner and SHPD. And then also that curation needs to have a component that involves archival or digital materials. So right now, the ARC firms maintain, hopefully, all of the digital records, the photographs, the field notes, and all that. And I think all of that information should be digital, and the SHPD should have an archive that maintains that, or some other agency or organization. But that material shouldn't be just stored by archaeology firm, and particularly as some of these archaeologists become more senior and they close their firms. And then the question is, where is that data going? And that really belongs to the community, to the public, and should be available.
For the Section 106 consultation process, how does an organization get onto the NHO list?
Okay, so the National Park Service maintains one, so you can contact the National Park Service. SHPD also maintains a list, so that we try to say, here are the organizations or interested parties who've identified themselves for this Oʻahu Pua'a or these kinds of projects. And then
Department of Interior.
yeah, so yeah, National Park Service at the Department of Interior. And then you can actually contact the individual agencies. So like the Army maintains a list. So they have certain interested parties who said, for example, the Historic Hawaii Foundation, who says, we want to be involved in all projects involving modifications to bridges and buildings, but we're not interested in projects that respond to this, or we're interested in projects for this installation but don't have a care, not that. So you can, those three sources right there.
Are there any other questions before we wrap up? Now is for real your last chance. If you do, raise your hand and we'll give you some leeway to type up your question. All right, so with that, I guess we're gonna wrap up. Mahalo nui everybody for joining us. Oh wait, I might have a question. Oh yeah. Mahalo nui everybody for joining us. And mahalo nui Susan and Andrew for everything, for your presentation today and for sharing with us all of the mana'o behind the rules, HRS 6E as well as Section 106. I know it's a very deep topic. But yeah, and we're also looking forward to everyone talking more with Ku'upua about the revisions as well. And so you guys probably know this. This is our first webinar as a collective, and so we are super eager to hear what everyone has to say as regards to feedback. And so as we close this up, there's going to be a survey link that's going to open up, and if you could please fill that out, that would be great help. Also, we will keep you guys updated. Again, this is the first of a series of 5 webinars. So we'll have 2 webinars coming up next month. So we'll be sending out those links as well. We're super excited. It's going to be a great year for the Kaliʻuokapaʻakai Collective. We have a lot in store in means of webinars, workshops. We also have a podcast coming out, so please stay tuned. At the end of the survey, there's also a question of if you would like to be engaged in the future with Kaliʻuokapaʻakai. And if you would, then it's really important that you put your email on the top. It's not put as a required part of the form, but if you want to be included in future Kaliʻuokapaʻakai initiatives and hear what we're doing, we kind of need a contact email to get you at. So if you could fill that out, that would be great. But mahalo nui everybody for joining. We look forward to talking to all of you soon, and we'll be getting out this recording for the webinar, as well as the handouts from Susan and Ku'upua's email to all of you later this week. Mahalo nui everybody for joining. Ahui ho.
Well,